Often ridiculed for its extremely slow performance and horrendously outdated hardware, the first-gen G4 Mac Mini managed to be the butt of many jokes, especially from PC enthusiasts, right from its release date in January of 2005. With a somewhat pathetic and noticeably outdated maximum clock speed of 1.42 GHz from its G4 processor, which was itself outdated, having been replaced by the G5, which itself was considered not competitive with the Intel processors of the time. Intel and AMD processors of the time had easily broken the 2 GHz barrier, and these processors were available in computers that didn't cost much more than the Mac Mini's starting price of just under $500. All this said, however, the G4 Mac Mini's embrace of hardware standards from the PC side, as well as low prices, would help Apple gain a foothold in the low-end market, and would help turn an increasingly disgruntled group of PC users fed up with the reliability and security issues that the then current versions of Windows were suffering from at the time into full-on Apple computer users, or Mac heads as they're also referred to as. Being a PC user in the mid-2000s was a challenge, to put it mildly. Windows XP, which had debuted in 2001, had been held up as the best operating system from Microsoft up until that time. Unfortunately, it wasn't exactly without its flaws. These flaws would eventually combine to permanently destroying its reputation as being secure. Based upon Microsoft's highly stable and reliable, but also business-oriented operating system, NT, aka Windows NT, Windows XP was a pure 32-bit operating system from the start, unlike the previous consumer-oriented Windows 3.1 and 3.11, etc., which were essentially 16/32-bit hybrids. To allow these and other operating systems such as Windows Millennium Edition to perform in 32-bit mode, the kernel was essentially tricked into believing it was the 32-bit operating system when it was in fact 16-bit only. The employment of this software trickery resulted in these operating systems becoming somewhat buggy when utilized in 32-bit mode. Another advantage of the NT operating system that would also eventually make its way onto Windows XP was the new NTFS file system. In sharp contrast to the old FAT32 system, which was limited to a cluster size no higher than 512 bytes, thus only allowing for a maximum file size of 4 gigabytes. In sharp contrast, NTFS was optimized for a maximum cluster size of 4 kilobits, but was capable of reading up to 2 megabits in size. In terms of clusters, the end result of these notably enlarged clusters was a theoretical maximum file size of 16 terabytes. The main advantage of the new format type, however, was a more stability for Windows, as the larger cluster processing ability meant the system was less likely to crash due to data issues, making the operating system all the more stable. Unfortunately, it was not all roses for the new NT-based Windows XP. The NT kernel itself had been developed for businesses that usually sat behind massive hardware firewalls, and thus viruses and other such things would not be issues. Mind you, at the time, security had not reached the critical mass it would later on in the mid-2000s, with a notably smaller percentage of consumer PCs being on the internet, and an even smaller percentage of those PCs having high-speed internet access, and thus far less likely to experience infections by malware. This, of course, would change drastically as Windows XP's life continued. And so the security of the operating system was not considered as important. Microsoft, realizing this, decided that it might actually be a better idea to simply make the consumer operating system much more like the business operating system for the sake of keeping the price down in terms of development, as well as reducing the time it would take to get the operating system out. And thus, Microsoft focused on making the operating system very easy to modify and/or hack. This would come back to bite them later on, as Windows XP, which would be based upon this kernel, would live primarily in consumer households, which usually only had software firewalls, even if that much, and were thus very much more vulnerable to attacks. This was aggravated by the fact that the operating system lacked basic security features such as to ask the consumer behind the keyboard whether or not they wanted to make a major change to the kernel, unless the said user was logged in on a restricted account. This thus opening the door for malware, such as viruses and spyware, to simply walk right in. Most notably rootkits, A particularly nasty type malware that once installed can cloak itself and basically make itself invisible to tools designed to delete it, and thus gain access to privileged information without the end consumer knowing about it. And at the same time being able to remain largely invisible even with the proper antivirus and anti-rootkit tools, thanks to its ability to cloak itself and hide in seemingly harmless files, all the while allowing said attacker to gain unfettered access to said computer, allowing for such things as the theft and or modification of documents on said computer, and or even allowing for the computer to be turned into a zombie machine to be utilized in attacks against larger systems. Then there was what was supposed to be Microsoft's savior, as it was once referred to as, Windows Vista, Microsoft's long-delayed successor of Windows XP, which at the same time was being pushed out with full force by Microsoft as Windows XP's reputation continued to go down in flames, which when finally released had a rather infamous reputation for, while being much more secure, and also now being 64-bit natively, gained a rather unfortunate but well-deserved reputation as being a resource hog, requiring a lot more power for things like its Aero interface to run effectively, and in most cases running noticeably slower than its Windows XP predecessor, especially on older hardware. This would prove a notable issue for Microsoft, as most of the computers Windows Vista was installed upon were essentially older Windows XP systems that lacked the hardware to take advantage of the new features built into Windows Vista, and in a lot of cases could just barely run the operating system in general, let alone make it run as intended. Also, its more aggressive, more security-oriented nature meant that the end consumer operating the PC would receive a prompt anytime said consumer tried to install software or make a change, in some cases requiring the user to be an administrator, that is to say the highest priority user on the computer, to make a simple change to a program, in turn requiring the consumer user of the PC to enter a password and hit OK in order for the system to proceed with this operation, something the average Windows/Windows XP user would not be used to and not very tolerant of, although for most other operating systems this was commonplace, although far less pronounced. But by far the worst situation facing Windows Vista was the fact that it was pushed over the finish line by Microsoft so aggressively that it was insufficiently tested to handle older hardware, to ensure that drivers would be available for older hardware, as well as these pieces of hardware being compatible with Windows Vista. This being a result of the time constraints. This meant that even if a said computer met the requirements for Windows Vista, there was still no guarantee and unfortunately a good chance that it wouldn't run correctly, and or the consumer would face a buggy, crashy experience, with plenty of blue screens as a side effect. All of this would add up to Windows Vista's reputation being left in tatters, as despite long delays in getting Windows Vista out, the fact that it was rushed in terms of getting it over the finish line meant that insufficient testing was done to catch a lot of the bugs that would eventually and unfortunately hit consumers head on. Where have I heard that story before? Microsoft was essentially forced to throw in the towel with Windows Vista and come up with what would eventually be known as Windows 7, which essentially was Windows Vista done the way it was supposed to be done. But essentially, at its core, Windows 7 was essentially a highly polished version of Windows Vista, with the UI being heavily optimized and several patches being done, as well as driver optimizations to ensure the consumer had a much more pleasant experience than that of course, Windows Vista. Where have I heard that story before? This whole time period, stretching from around 2004 all the way until 2009, when Windows 7 would finally debut, created a very difficult period to be a PC user. But there were no alternatives. Or were there? Apple Computer's Macintosh debuted way back in the 1980s. At the time, it was considered revolutionary for its graphical user interface. Unfortunately, it came up short on sheer power, as well as abilities from its graphical user interface operating system due to the lack of power, which was thanks to a function follows form design philosophy imposed by the Macintosh development team's head and Apple's co-founder, Steve Jobs, who was more interested in producing a computer that looked nice rather than a computer that seemingly was functional, seemingly unable to articulate the fact that these two were not one and the same, and were at least not at that time possible, which was simply the result of processors of the early 80s not having the power to push something like this device to the speeds it would need in order to run the graphical user interface effectively, thus resulting in an extremely sluggish gray toaster, as it was nicknamed, that really didn't have much to show for itself in terms of apps or performance. This already terrible situation was further aggravated by the fact that Jobs refused to allow a fan to be installed on the computer because he didn't like them. This meant that the processor's performance would have to be further curtailed in order to allow the computer to remain cool enough to function correctly. This meant the development team at the time, instead of actually designing hardware to fit the software, would do the opposite, designing software to fit the hardware. While this seems like a simple and logical solution to the problem, it would in fact lead to more problems, which would grow in size as the operating system aged and more performance, not to mention features, were required of it. This would lead to things such as multitasking, which allows multiple programs to run at once, one of the actual main advantages of a graphical user interface, to be removed entirely. This was in addition to the fact that limited RAM and slow processors on the early Macintoshes would cause them to run whatever limited software there was very slow, which at launch, I must add, contained a very diverse selection of two programs, Mac Paint and Mac Write. The end result would produce a computer that really wasn't very useful, chiefly because of this and a lack of software availability for it at launch, and was at the same time quite expensive, costing nearly $2,500 in, mind you, 1980s cash. This in turn led to lack of sales, which would eventually lead to Steve Jobs being pushed out of his own company. By then, Apple's CEO, who was ironically enough one of Steve Jobs' own choices, John Sculley. While Apple would go on to be very successful after Steve Jobs' departure in the latter 80s and well into the 90s, it would eventually start to lose momentum drastically in the mid-90s, especially after Windows 95 debuted, which finally united Microsoft's old warhorse DOS up with its actual graphical user interface Windows into one cohesive package that could also take advantage of the new, far more powerful Intel processors that were streaming onto the market with ever higher clock speeds and ever higher performance, leaving the Motorola chips that Apple was utilizing at that time for its Macintoshes in the dust. And while at this point Apple managed to finally get a form of multitasking in its aging Mac OS called cooperative multitasking, where the programs essentially have to, as the name implies, cooperate to share memory and resources so they can run together on the same platform and essentially take turns being the center of attention, Windows 95 had full multitasking, allowing each program to run completely independently of each other without having to ask permission to share resources, etc. This meant that one would experience much better performance when multitasking on the PC, and with more reliability compared to a Macintosh when multitasking. In every way, this mopped the floor with Apple's products. And as if this wasn't bad enough for Apple, and it most certainly was, the PCs were becoming ever more cheaper with this enhanced performance. Apple computers were, again, always known for having a higher price and somewhat higher tier in terms of being a product that was higher up there than a PC product. This had been a deliberate move by John Sculley, who found that there was a high-end market for the graphical user interface, and for a time this served Apple very well. As for a time in the late 80s and very early 90s, there was simply nothing quite like the Macintosh's graphical user interface in performance, and thus it had a niche that was ever growing with people willing to pay the extra money to get this higher-end product. But at this point, in the early to mid-90s, even its higher-tier components couldn't compete with that of the entry-level PC components in some cases, and its operating system was becoming a joke as it was so far outdated by this point, mainly due to, again, the hand-strung nature of its original development for the original Macintosh way back in the early 80s. Further aggravating this whole situation was the incompetence of Michael Spindler, John Scully's successor, who couldn't seem to understand what the company's strengths were. He decided to take the Macintosh line down market to compete with the cheap PC clones of the time. To make this happen, Apple would have to produce a Macintosh with lower-end and/or cheap hardware underneath the hood. This by itself was beyond an idiotic decision, as most of Apple's income came from its hardware. This would mean Apple only made a limited profit on each of these computers. To further compound this decision, Spindler decided to, on top of everything else, blow these particular models up with all kinds of crazy software packages. In fact, the differences between models had to do with the software you got with the computer, while the hardware remained the same across these particular product lines. And as if all of this wasn't enough, Spindler decided to start licensing the Macintosh operating system out to third-party clones, which further reduced Apple's profit margins. Many of the third-party clones began to take sales away from Apple, which further again reduced the amount of money the company made off of its hardware. With all this in mind, there were plenty of people who simply ran for the safety and security of a PC. After all, at least then you knew what you were getting. Specifically, a much more capable operating system, as by this point in time in the mid-90s, the Mac OS was really starting to look like a joke. It was known for crashing, having issues with even the cooperative multitasking that was installed, and basically all around buggy and slow compared to what the PC could do. Spindler would make an attempt to replace the macOS operating system with a new project called Copeland, whose development would begin in 1995. Copeland became a bloated mess, with several features being added in over and over again, to the point where the core that was developed was so unstable, it really didn't actually function at all, being prone to sudden and unpredictable crashes, even from just sitting at idle. Luckily for Apple at this point, it wasn't all bad news. One of the few intelligent decisions Spindler had made at this point was to switch over to the PowerPC chip, a collaboration between IBM, who developed the chip, and Motorola, who produced it. This particular chip in its G3 variant would eventually kick Intel's tail all over the place, and did it with far less power consumption. This is thanks to its RISC architecture, which utilized reduced instruction sets to make a more efficient processor that was able to work much harder than the Intel processors of the day, but with far less effort. By 1996, after incompetent decision, Michael Spindler was replaced by Gil Amelio. One of Gil's first and more important decisions, other than decluttering the Apple product line, was to axe the development of Copeland and thus look for an alternative, which would eventually be found in the way of Next OS, developed by Next Computers, Steve Jobs' next venture after he was fired from Apple, or resigned from Apple, depending upon which side of the story you believe. While Next had never been profitable and was essentially bankrupt by the time Apple had taken it over, its operating system was something that the company could definitely work with and thus use to salvage its own fate. Apple's product line would also continue to evolve to deal with a new market in which the PC was dominant. Unlike before, where all the standards such as the previously mentioned DisplayPort that the Macintosh used, known as a DB15, which was not compatible with PC ports, requiring anyone switching from a PC to a Macintosh to purchase an all-new monitor, as well as, of course, a keyboard and mouse, as those ports were not compatible. Apple would begin to embrace PC standards, such as VGA, and a curious new port being promoted by both Apple and the PC industry called USB, which would eventually take off and become a standard used in all devices, including the PC, as well as Macintoshes and other Apple products. While the plans for the company's turnaround were promising, they also cost money, and Apple's severe financial situation meant it had no choice but to turn to its biggest foe, Microsoft, for an investment. This would be announced at MacWorld Boston in 1997, for which, in addition to Microsoft gaining a huge chunk of ownership of the company, it would also be allowed to bundle its new web browser, Internet Explorer, with all new Macintoshes. With Steve Jobs now back at the helm of the company, now as the official CEO, bringing the company back full circle, the company in turn decided to return to its roots with the iMac, a basically redoing of the original Macintosh that had come out more than a decade before, but with translucent plastic and a much more affordable price tag, with entry-level models starting below the $1,000 mark. While this was cheap for a Macintosh, it was still much more expensive than most of the PCs on the market. You could get a moderate specified PC for that price, with notably more power than an entry-level model would have. This was again an entry-level Macintosh with entry-level specs, although they had been greatly enhanced thanks to the new G3 PowerPC processor. Then Apple's new Mac OS based upon Next OS finally debuted with a very exciting name of OS X, which would debut in September of 2001. This particular operating system was definitely the revolution that the company needed. Unfortunately, it was quite buggy and sluggish in its early iterations. In sharp contrast to Mac OS X, also known as Mac OS X, Windows XP, which would debut a few months later, was considered snappy, elegant, and reliable for the time. Of course, this wouldn't last. It would take a while for Apple's hardware to finally catch up with its new operating system, the inverse of what it was originally, with the operating system being ahead of the hardware. Finally, when the stars did align, right around the early 2000s, there was a very disastrous situation going on the PC market, and Apple had a very big opportunity standing in front of it. The one thing stopping from Apple from moving forward was that it did not have a product that was well priced enough to take advantage of this market. The entry-level computer for Apple at that time, the iMac, was still priced at just under $1,000, making the leap even bigger for a person switching from a PC to a Macintosh to take. And this is where the Mac Mini came in. A small box of a computer designed to use a PC user's existing monitor, keyboard, and mouse. And thus, if I may paraphrase a very ancient term, if one can't giveth with a price, taketh away. That would sell for very reasonable, for Apple, $499. This was unheard of at the time, especially considering the fact that, again, Apple made most of its profit off of its hardware. The tactic being utilized by Apple here was really quite simple and had been done several times over by the likes of BMW and other high-end brands. Entice the customer in with a model that didn't cost very much but was noticeably less powerful or capable than the higher-end models, and cause that customer to want to upgrade to a higher-end model, thus generating more sales for the company in the long run, and thus gaining more customers in the process and/or increasing market share. The first-gen Mac Mini was propelled by a G4 processor and equipped with a polycarbonate top and base, and thus was referred to as a G4 polycarbonate. In sharp contrast to the translucent plastic of the iMacs from the late 90s, and typical of Apple's new minimalistic design philosophy, it was an extremely small but very sleek-looking shiny box with rounded corners and a slot-loading optical drive, which was utilized to not disrupt the beautiful lines of the face of the unit. With optical drives still being very popular as well as common in the mid-2000s, the Mac Mini could be ordered with either a combo CD, DVD, ROM drive or a super drive, which could also read CDs and DVDs, but in addition could also burn CDs. At the far left of the rear of the unit, we have the power switch, and just below it, the connection for the external power supply. This is one of the tricks Apple employed in keeping the size for the unit down, allowing it to have the smallest footprint possible. Moving our way further left and below the actual fan grill for the single exhaust fan on the unit itself, we see the Ethernet jack, followed by the 56K modem. Again, this was the mid-2000s when dial-up was still pretty popular, followed by a DVI port for display out. Again, Apple was utilizing PC standards at the time to make these units as compatible as possible with existing PC users' equipment. Next to the DVI port are two USB ports, specifically USB 2.0, plus a FireWire and a headset jack. There is an internal speaker on the device, as was and still is typical on most Macintosh computers. However, as many Mac users know, this speaker always tends to be not so high quality in sound output. The headset jack can double as a sound output connection for a set of external speakers to improve sound quality for the computer. The G4 processor utilized in the Mac Mini's time was at hand, much like its successor, the G5, as it was proven over and over again, unfortunately, that at higher speeds, the G4 and particularly G5 models required insane cooling systems. One particular model, specifically the G5 Mac Pro, including a radiator from that of a car and even utilizing GM's own DexCool to keep the processor at a temperature that would allow it to function reliably. The Mac Mini itself was no stranger to overheating issues, specifically the graphics card, causing artifacts in the form of triangles to appear on the screen when this took place. The G4 specifically was also more archaic than that of the Intel/AMD processors of the time, still 32-bit based, while AMD had long since gone to 64-bit, and Intel was just introducing 64-bit processors at this time. The processor speeds for this particular model were also very slow, starting at only 1.25 GHz, stepping up then to 1.33 and 1.42, and finally 1.5 at the top end. These processors were considered very slow even for the time. One must also remember that this is also a time in which the G4 and G5 alike had both failed to be as competitive with Intel per clock cycle, and thus even for these low speeds, these processors were considered sluggish in terms of their performance. To help deal with the lack of performance generated by these particular processors, Apple would utilize a new concept in the computer industry called GPU computing. This meant utilizing a graphics card to help offload some of the tasks the CPU would have to normally deal with, such as the playback of DVDs. The graphics card that Apple would utilize for these tasks and or install in the first generation was the ATI Radeon 9200, specifically a model equipped with 32 megabytes of SD RAM. This would actually give the Mac Mini a decent ability to game at the time. While this graphics card may sound impressive at first here, it was in fact an older part that was being recycled for use in the Mac Mini, introduced back in 2002. The concept again was to offer as much bang for the buck, and so older hardware would simply be adapted. This was probably also helped along by the fact that Apple had a deal with ATI to provide all of the graphics cards for its computers of the time, and would actually make this unit very preferable to vintage Mac gaming with a specific mod done. More on that later. RAM specifications were limited to 333 MHz with as little as 256 megabytes installed. Again, very minimal even for the time. Configuration options for this particular model were as follows. The early 2005 variant, the first ones introduced, started off with a base clock speed of 1.25 GHz with a more powerful 1.42 GHz processor as an option. The units could be equipped with as much as 1 GB of RAM, but it started off with a base specification of 256 megs of RAM. Again, the RAM was only rated at 333 MHz. The mid-2005 refresh for the Mac Mini saw the 1.25 GHz G4 processor removed and replaced with a 1.33 GHz G4 processor. The top of the line remained the 1.42, which was a carryover from the early release. RAM for these refresh models now started at 512 megabytes, but was once again expandable all the way up to 1 gigabyte. Speeds were still limited to 333 MHz, although apparently both of these models were compatible with higher speed RAM. The RAM specifications would remain the same to the final refresh of late 2005, where a 1.5 GHz G4 processor was introduced, and the original 1.42 and the 1.33 were dropped. Hard drive options will remain the same for the first generation G4 Mac Mini, ranging from 40 gigabytes to 80 gigabytes of capacity. As mentioned before, the G4 processor had long since lost its battle with Intel, and the processors on the Mac Mini were no exception and had no possible chance of chewing the coattails, if you would, of even the slowest processors being offered by Intel and AMD at the time, due to the fact that in addition to their very low clock speeds compared to the Intel processors at the time, the performance of these processors per clock was also very low. However, that was not the purpose. Again, the idea was to get people into the Macintosh line so that they would upgrade to a more expensive model and thus make Apple more money in that regard. The unique shoebox-like design of the Mac Mini meant that it could fit on one's desk very easily, even next to an existing PC. All one had to do was basically buy a splitter and or a KVM switch, which would allow the end user to share a keyboard, mouse, as well as monitor with an existing PC. Thus, the PC user was able to essentially try Mac OS without having to make a major investment in terms of space or money to get a setup running. Speaking of Mac OS, there were a few different variations of Mac OS X that were available on the first-gen Mac Mini. The first was 10.3 Panther, then toward its latter production, the default OS got changed to 10.4 Tiger. All of these variants were upgradable to 10.5 Leopard. It should come as no surprise that the first-gen Mac Mini really wasn't all that great a performer with Mac OS X, as it simply took too much of the limited resources available from the already slow processors that these units were equipped with. The graphics card certainly did help out here, and while it was certainly utilizable, one would definitely notice a difference between this particular model and an entry-level iMac, for example. But again, the idea was to inspire a person who bought a Mac Mini to spend even more money and buy a higher-end Mac. Sales figures for the first-gen G4 Mac Mini literally had me drawing a blank, as I could not find any information on how well the unit did. From what I have been able to gather, it appears that this unit was not as successful as Apple was hoping, but then again, that was not the main focus here. The idea was to use this particular device to entice people into an Apple store, in which the prospective Mac Mini buyer would be enticed to purchase something like an iMac or a Mac Pro. Even if the prospective Mac Mini buyer could not be convinced to buy an iMac or a Mac Pro, it was more than likely when they came to upgrade it sometime later that they would choose one of these higher-end options, or at least at minimal, grab one of the new versions of the Mac Mini. The G4 Mac Mini would only be in production with Apple for 1 year, as within 5 months of its release in June of 2005, Apple announced it was switching to Intel processors for its entire line. In fact, its replacement, which would be the first-gen Intel Mac Mini, would be announced in February of 2006, just over a year later. While the Core Solo and Core Duo Mac Minis were considered better overall performers than the G4 Mac Mini, this generation of the Mac Mini was actually far less capable of gaming than the old G4 was, mainly because the G4 Mac Mini had its own dedicated graphics card, while the Intel Mac had to rely on and/or was saddled with the onboard Intel graphics, which were far behind that of even other onboard solutions, and obviously could never match the performance of a dedicated graphics card. One would think the G4 Mac Mini has been pretty much made completely useless these days due to Apple's planned obsolescence, which has long since taken effect on the G4 Mac Mini, especially considering it was not that capable of a performer to begin with. Far from it. Thanks to the retro gaming community and vintage Mac enthusiasts alike, specifically that of the OS 9 Lives project, there is now a variant of Mac OS 9 which was never available in the past that will run on the G4 Mac Mini. And while this unit was very sluggish in Mac OS X, as it turns out the specifications it has make it more than capable of performing in Mac OS 9. Especially considering its graphics card. Even the G4 processor, which was known for its lack of performance in OS X/OS X, performs much better here in OS 9, allowing it to really strut its stuff. The best thing about the G4 Mac Mini is that again it doesn't take up much space, which makes it even more practical for this sort of vintage gaming. Meaning, unlike most other Macintoshes of the time, which took up quite a bit of space, this unit can easily be stored in the corner of a room or even on one's desk, where it basically looks as unassuming as anything else. So if you have one of these sitting in the back of your closet, you might want to think twice about having it recycled, especially if you're looking for a small vintage gaming box. In fact, this mod has become so popular that the prices of G4 Mac Minis have started to climb. You can now end up paying in excess of $300 for a unit that is in perfect condition, although it is easy to find one under $100 if you're careful. For more information on this type mod, take a look at my Mac Mini Retro video. While it isn't a DIY, it does give a lot of information as to how to proceed with this particular modification. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe, as it will help me greatly, and comment as well. And as always, keep the metal side down.